He's silent, clever, and pink, and yet, somehow, he's one of the most iconic characters in animation history. But not all Pink Panthers are created equal. From modern reboots to the original theatrical masterpieces, some eras changed everything, while others, you might want to forget. Today, we're ranking every Pink Panther era from worst to best, diving deep into animation, humor, style, and cultural impact. And trust me, the #1 era is untouchable. Stay tuned, because some of these rankings might surprise you. So grab some popcorn, settle in, and let's dive into the full history of the Pink Panther, ranked definitively from worst to greatest. But before we get into the video, kindly subscribe to the Animation Memory for more content like this. By 1980, the original theatrical run of Pink Panther shorts had ended. MGM's animation studio was long closed, and television had become the main platform for animated content. This period is what we call the repackaging era. The Pink Panther Laugh and a Half-Hour and a Half show, think Pink Panther and Sons, slightly later but connected to the same mindset. During 1980 to 1981, instead of creating new theatrical shorts, the studio focused on re-editing older MGM shorts, making new intro sequences, bundling episodes for TV syndication, updating title cards and bumpers. Basically, very little original animation was made. This wasn't about reinventing the Pink Panther, it was about distributing him efficiently. By the late 1970s, theatrical animated shorts were on the decline across the industry. TV syndication was cheaper, faster, and more profitable. Networks wanted content that was already made, and the Pink Panther had a huge library of high-quality shorts ready to go. From a business perspective, repackaging made perfect sense. From a creative perspective, however, it marked a slowdown. Animation style didn't evolve. Comedy formula stayed unchanged. Character depth didn't grow. The only real changes were in how the content was presented, how episodes were grouped, branding structure, new opening sequences, while the core short stayed the same. So this era preserved the Pink Panther, it didn't push him forward. When we rank the eras based on creativity and evolution, the repackaging era comes in last. Why? Almost no new storytelling was introduced. It relied almost entirely on old material. Animation and structure weren't innovated. The focus was maintenance, not growth. But let's be clear, it wasn't bad. This era was historically important. Without this syndication push, the Pink Panther could have faded from public memory in the early 1980s. It kept the character visible to a new generation and maintained his relevance. It just didn't innovate. The repackaging era is crucial historically, but ranks last in terms of creativity. It kept the Panther alive, but it didn't advance him. By the late 2000s, classic cartoon revivals were becoming common. Studios were asking, can legacy characters survive in the YouTube generation? Can silent slapstick compete with fast-paced, dialogue-heavy cartoons? How do you introduce Pink Panther to kids who didn't grow up with him? The answer was a reboot built specifically for modern children's television. And in 2010, Pink Panther and Pals was born. This was not just a continuation, this was a structural shift. Fully digital production, sharper outlines, brighter colors, faster visual pacing. The minimalist 60s aesthetic was replaced with a more contemporary TV look. Classic Pink Panther comedy relied on slow build-ups, silence, visual tension, clever escalation. The 2010 reboot relied on rapid scene transitions, quick reaction humor, high-energy pacing, short attention span storytelling. This was clearly designed for modern kids. In the original eras, Pink Panther was calm, calculated, quietly mischievous, almost elegant. In the 2010 version, he became more expressive, slightly more reactive, surrounded by louder supporting characters. The focus shifted from subtle cleverness to energetic conflict. To be fair, and this is important for credibility, this reboot succeeded in introducing Pink Panther to a new generation, keeping the brand active in modern TV spaces, updating the character visually without fully redesigning him. Maintaining mostly non-verbal humor, he still largely avoids speaking. It respected the core concept more than the 1993 series did. That matters. This era ranks above the repackaging era because it created new content, it attempted modernization, it took creative risks, it adapted to a new media environment. However, it ranks below the higher eras because the comedy lost subtlety, the pacing sacrificed tension building, the storytelling felt simplified, it lacked the cultural impact of earlier theatrical and TV eras. It modernized Pink Panther, but it did not redefine him. The 2010 reboot was reactive, not revolutionary. It responded to the modern cartoon climate instead of setting the standard. Earlier eras influenced animation history. This era followed trends. That's the difference. The 2010 Modern Reboot deserves credit for survival and adaptation, but when ranking based on innovation, impact, and comedic mastery, it simply doesn't reach the artistic heights of the theatrical or classic TV eras. It proved Pink Panther could survive in the 21st century. It just didn't prove he was at his best there. And while the 2010 reboot modernized the Panther for a new generation, the next era made an even more controversial decision. It gave him a voice. By the early 1990s, animation had changed dramatically. TV networks wanted talking characters, more complex plots, stronger, character-driven stories. Silent slapstick, the kind that made the original Pink Panther famous, was now considered outdated for modern television. Kids' shows were moving away from purely visual comedy and toward dialogue-heavy storytelling. So in 1993, the studio tried something bold. They revived Pink Panther for a new generation by blending nostalgia with contemporary 90s storytelling. And this is where things changed in a big way. For the first time ever, the Pink Panther had a voice, provided by Matt Frewer.
I wonder if Donald Trump has days like this.
Now, he speaks in full sentences. Episodes are structured more like sitcoms. Humor comes from dialogue and situations instead of silent visual gags. The effect? On one hand, he feels more relatable. His personality becomes more defined. On the other, the elegant, minimal, silent genius of the original shorts is sacrificed. The mystery and charm of a wordless character is replaced with traditional TV comedy structure. The 90s update didn't just affect the voice, it changed the look too. Cleaner line work, brighter, more vibrant colors. Backgrounds are more detailed and less abstract than the minimalist 60s style. Animation is smoother. However, while technically polished, the visual gags are less expressive. The iconic minimalism that made the original era timeless is toned down. It looks modern, but not quite as legendary. This era also expands the world of Pink Panther. Side characters now have defined personalities. There's a recurring cast. Episodes follow traditional story arcs instead of open-ended visual scenarios. The effect? Adds narrative variety, expands the universe, but reduces the pure visual humor that defined the early Panther. It's less about clever, silent problem-solving, and more about sitcom-style storytelling. Introduced Pink Panther to a whole new generation, expanded the universe and supporting cast, experimented creatively instead of lazily copying the past, gave the Panther dialogue while keeping his mischievous spirit, modernized the franchise to meet 90s TV standards. This wasn't a cash grab, it was genuine experimentation. Dialogue compromises the silent brilliance that made the character iconic. Animation is competent, but not timeless. Cultural impact is smaller compared to the theatrical and classic TV eras. Most fans still idolize the 60s and 70s versions. It sits above the 2010 reboot because it took real creative risks. It created fully original episodes. It expanded the character's personality in meaningful ways. But it ranks below the top 3 eras because it didn't reinvent silent comedy. It lacks the cultural weight and historical impact of the originals. The 1993 revival era was bold, ambitious, and divisive. It gave the Panther a voice, a personality, and modern relevance, but it also reminded audiences why silent visual comedy was the true heart of the character's genius. Not every creative risk lands perfectly, even when it's made with good intentions. And speaking of genius, the next era, the classic TV franchise era, didn't just preserve Pink Panther's legacy, it perfected it for a generation of fans who grew up watching him on their screens. By the late 1960s, theatrical animation was slowing down, but television? Television was booming. MGM saw an opportunity. Instead of letting the Pink Panther remain just a theatrical character, they built a television package designed to bring Pink Panther into millions of homes, expand the universe with new characters, extend the life of the original theatrical shorts, create original content specifically for TV. This era became the bridge between cinematic artistry and mass cultural impact. The original theatrical shorts didn't disappear, they were repackaged for TV. New bumpers were added, and episodes were structured as variety-style blocks that included the The classic Pink Panther shorts. The Inspector, a clumsy detective with dialogue-driven slapstick. The Ant and the Aardvark, an experimental predator versus prey spin-off. Roland and Ratfink, a comedic rivalry series. This format gave audiences variety while keeping the franchise rooted in visual comedy. Even though the show was now on television, it didn't abandon its core identity. The Pink Panther shorts kept their silent, minimalist charm. Timing and pacing were carefully preserved. Gags still escalated visually rather than relying on heavy dialogue. Some segments, like The Inspector, included speaking characters, but visual humor remained the focus. That's why this era still feels authentic to the Panther's roots. This is also when the franchise branding became legendary. The iconic Henry Mancini theme became inseparable from the character. Music was used to punctuate jokes and build tension. The Pink Panther image became instantly recognizable worldwide. This era transformed Pink Panther from a clever theatrical novelty into a true television icon. The show was syndicated globally, reaching millions of children and adults. For many fans, this was their first exposure to the character. This era defined how audiences perceived Pink Panther for decades, embedded him into pop culture, introduced spin-offs that influenced later revivals and reboots. If the theatrical era created the genius, the TV era spread it everywhere. Strengths: expanded the universe without losing the original charm, perfected silent slapstick for TV pacing, introduced new characters who became iconic, achieved massive global reach and cultural penetration. Limitations: relied heavily on repackaged theatrical content, didn't introduce as much creative innovation as the golden and expansion theatrical eras. Some segments were simplified for television audiences. It ranks above the 1993 and 2010 eras because it kept the Panther silent and clever. It avoided turning him into a heavily dialogue-driven character. It reached the largest audience in franchise history up to that point. It maintained consistent comedic quality, but it ranks below number 2 and number 1 because those eras defined the character visually and conceptually. Television depended heavily on previously established material. Creative originality was more limited compared to the theatrical peak. The TV franchise era took genius and made it accessible. It preserved the Panther's identity while expanding his world. It's where audiences truly learned to love him, but it was more continuation than reinvention. And while the TV era perfected distribution and franchise building, the next era, the theatrical expansion era, pushed Pink Panther's creative boundaries even further, introducing new rivals, refining visual gags, and delivering the peak of silent comedy craftsmanship.
After the initial golden theatrical era, 1963 to 1967, Pink Panther was already a proven concept. Audiences loved the silent, clever humor. MGM wanted to expand the character and universe without losing the minimalistic charm. From 1968 to 1978, the shorts refined and experimented, introduced recurring rivals like the Little Man, creating dynamic conflict, explored more elaborate gags and cinematic pacing, polished the minimalist aesthetic to a more stylish, sophisticated look. This era represents Pink Panther at the peak of theatrical creativity. The Little Man, often called Big Nose, became the Panther's foil. These interactions allowed more complex comedic setups. The rivalry gave the Panther opportunities for visual cleverness on a higher narrative level. More fluid animation compared to the 1963 to 1967, shorts backgrounds retained minimalism but had stylized depth. Color palettes and camera angles were experimented with for cinematic effect. This is animation evolution, without overcomplicating the core simplicity. Longer sequences allowed for slow burn gags. Visual misdirection, anticipation, and escalation were perfected. Music by Henry Mancini remained central, enhancing timing and mood. This is the Panther's most technically precise era and comedy at its sharpest. These shorts were theatrically released worldwide, expanded brand recognition before TV domination, influenced other animators and comedy-driven cartoons. This era is often overlooked because TV got most of the nostalgia attention, but for animation historians, this is the creative pinnacle before franchising took over. So, what makes the theatrical expansion era stand out? Well, for starters, it expanded the Pink Panther universe creatively. We got new rivals, more structured plots, and longer sequences that let the comedy breathe. The visual gags, perfected. The timing, spot on. And through it all, the Panther kept that silent, sophisticated charm we all love. On top of that, the animation itself was elevated. smoother, more stylish, and just a joy to watch. Of course, there are a few limitations. Compared to TV, these shorts had limited distribution, so not everyone saw them back then. And while brilliant, they don't quite have the raw, groundbreaking magic of the golden theatrical era, the one that created Pink Panther from scratch. Overall, this era ranks above the TV franchise era because it didn't just repackage old material, it innovated and refined the character. But it still sits just below number 1, because the golden era is where it all began, establishing the Panther's iconic design, personality, and timeless silent comedy genius. The theatrical expansion era represents Pink Panther at the height of creative experimentation. It polished the formula, introduced memorable rivals, and created sophisticated visual gags. It's where the Panther evolved from a brilliant idea into a master of cinematic comedy, but it still builds on the foundation laid by the golden era. And now we arrive at the pinnacle. The era that started it all, defined the character, and set the standard for all that followed. The golden theatrical era of 1963 to 1967. The golden era isn't just the first era, and it's the era that created Pink Panther. Debuting in the opening credits of the 1963 live-action film The Pink Panther, the character immediately stood out, silent, mischievous, and visually striking. The first short, The Pink Fink, won an Academy Award, proving the concept's brilliance. Minimalism, elegance, and perfect comedic timing defined the Panther. This era laid the foundation for every subsequent adaptation. All later series, reboots, and TV shows are measured against it. Pink Panther communicates entirely through expression, body language, and movement. No dialogue, no explanation. The audience interprets everything visually. Every gag is timed to perfection, often set to Henry Mancini's iconic theme. This is comedy distilled to its purest form. Clean lines, bold colors, and simple backgrounds. Each movement is precisely crafted for visual impact. Economy of design meant nothing distracted from the character's actions. The aesthetic is timeless, inspiring countless animators. Pink Panther's slender, elegant silhouette, contrasted with foils like the little man in later shorts, a unique balance of sophistication and mischief. Even today, his design is instantly recognizable worldwide. First era to define the Panther's identity, personality, and universe. Introduced audiences to a silent, visual comedy star in a modern era. Academy recognition cemented legitimacy and influence, inspired all later adaptations, from TV to reboots. Without this era, none of the later expansions, TV shows, or modern reboots would exist. Strengths: absolute originality. This is where the Panther was invented. Perfect comedic timing, silent humor at its finest, minimalist artistry, elegant, timeless animation. Cultural and historical impact. Set the standard for the franchise, no significant weaknesses. Later eras could refine, modernize, or expand, but nothing surpasses the sheer creativity and foundational genius of the golden era. This is Pink Panther at its purest. Silent, clever, visually stunning, and completely original. Every laugh, every movement, every clever twist was groundbreaking at the time, and still holds up today. The golden theatrical era didn't just create a character, it created a timeless icon of animation history. And there you have it, from passive syndication in the 1980s through modern reboots and talking experiments to the TV classics and theatrical masterpieces, we've ranked every Pink Panther era. It's a journey that shows how a simple, silent, mischievous pink character became a cultural icon, shaping animation history for decades, and why the golden era will always be number 1.
And there you have it, every Pink Panther era ranked from the least impactful to the ultimate masterpiece. From the cautious syndication of the repackaging era to the genius of the golden theatrical era, we've seen how this clever, silent, and mischievous character evolved over decades. Which era is your favorite? Do you agree with our ranking? Or do you think the 1993 revival or the 2010 Modern Reboot deserves a higher spot? Let me know in the comments. I read every one, and I want to hear your thoughts. If you loved this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to see more animation history breakdowns. And remember, Pink Panther isn't just pink, he's timeless.